Poets responded to and shaped the national understanding of what the war's most evocative figures, most notably Lincoln himself, but also Grant and Lee, shown here with excerpts of elegies from Ambrose Bierce, whose most famous work is the Civil War story and occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge. And underneath Lee, you have Julia Ward House, who is best known for the Battle Hymn of the Republic, but here she's crossing the line to commemorate Lee. Poet Sidney Lanier, a Confederate blockade runner who ended up a POW, wrote this poem in honor of Confederate hero Thomas Stonewall Jackson. The dying words of Stonewall Jackson. Order A.P. Hill to prepare for battle. Tell Major Hawks to advance the commissary train. Let us cross the river and rest in the shade. The stars of night contain the glittering day and bring his glory down with sweeter grace upon the dark world's grand, enchanted face, all loath to turn away. And so the day, about to yield his breath, utters the stars unto the listening night, to stand for burning fare-thee wells of light, set on the verge of death. O hero life that lit us like the sun, O hero words that glittered like the stars, and stood and shone above the gloomy wars when the hero life was done. The phantoms of the battle came to dwell in fitful vision of his dying eyes. Yet even in battle dreams, he sends supplies to those he loves so well. His army stands in battle line arrayed. His couriers fly. All's done. Now God decide. And not till then saw he the other side, or would accept the shade. Thou land whose sun is gone, thy stars remain. Still shine the words that miniature his deeds, O thrice beloved, where'er thy great heart bleeds. Solace hast thou for pain.
Such elegies continue into the 20th century. For example, Robert Lowell's For the Union Dead commemorates Robert Gould Shaw, who led the African-American Massachusetts 54th Infantry in an inspiring, if futile, assault on the Confederate stronghold at Fort Wagner, South Carolina. Parking spaces luxuriate like civic sand piles in the heart of Boston. A girdle of orange, Puritan pumpkin-colored girders braces the tingling State House. Shaking over the excavations as it faces Colonel Shaw and his bell-cheeked Negro infantry on St. Gaudens's shaking Civil War relief, propped by a plank splint against the garage's earthquake. 2 months after marching through Boston, half the regiment was dead. In the years leading up to the war, among the most polarizing and energizing Americans was John Brown, seen as both fearless crusader and ruthless terrorist. Shown here in John Stuart Curry's mural at the Kansas State Capitol. Brown was figured in Melville's portent as the meteor of the war, referring to the tendency to read the appearance of comets and meteors as omens.
As we've already indicated, music and poetry have always been closely related, but perhaps more so in the 1800s when both were less thoroughly professionalized than now. During this period, you would have newspapers where ordinary people would have poems alongside Longfellow or somebody really famous, and people were making music with these poems as well. After his execution for treason softened John Brown's rough edges a bit, he was memorialized in a popular marching song for Union soldiers, which in turn was elevated to a loftier status by new lyrics provided by poet Julia Ward Howe. We know the Battle Hymn of the Republic is a Yankee equivalent to Dixie, but despite the obvious pre-existing melody, Americans were first exposed to the words as a poem published in the Atlantic Monthly.
Abolition was perhaps the single most important cause for public poets of the 19th century. John Greenleaf Whittier, identified as the slave's poet for his activist verse, once disguised himself, joined a pro-slavery mob, and broke into his own office to rescue some papers when the mob was burning the office. Even the famously non-political Henry Wadsworth Longfellow praised John Brown, donated money to abolitionist groups, and you can see in his journals from those days, it'll say like $3 to free a slave, or he's entering kind of a ledger of the things that he did, $5 for slavery relief, things on that order. Even Longfellow composed a 7-poem sequence, and he had been asked to do it by a politician friend of his, and he sent them from Europe actually ahead of it, and the 7 poems were published as poems on slavery. But also according to historian Jill Lepore, Longfellow's Paul Revere's Ride, published on the day that South Carolina seceded from the Union, was seen by contemporary readers as an allegory linking the coming conflict with the American Revolution. Longfellow's poem follows Revere's route, but pointedly emphasizes places significant in the fight against slavery, and reinterprets. He used a letter that Paul Revere wrote that kind of, much later than his ride, actually. And but the letter kind of details the way he went. And what Longfellow does is he takes more or less the same route, but at every chance he gets, he stops and examines, like, the black cemetery, the cemetery where slaves were buried, or other kind of monuments or references that he could make to the fight against slavery. So it's very indirect. But he emphasizes places significant in the fight against slavery, and even echoes passages in his own previously published, widely read poems on slavery. Longfellow was extremely popular, and when he published a book, everybody would get it and read those poems. So when he would take and echo his own phrasings, his own words, and his own scenes, anyone could make the connection. And Lepore uncovered the idea that though we kind of misread that poem over the years, or haven't placed it in that kind of context, it was actually a pretty clever, if understated, Longfellow was famously nice, didn't want to ruffle any feathers, attack on slavery. Frances Ellen Watkins Harper was a free black woman who achieved considerable fame for her abolitionist poetry. He was probably the best-known African-American poet before Paul Laurence Dunbar. She later wrote poems encouraging the men of the North to take up arms. That's her phrase, the men of the North. In the following poem, she targets, like Douglas, the pretense of justifying slavery as God's will. The poem is called Bible Defense of Slavery. Take sackcloth of the darkest dye, and shroud the pulpits round. Servants of him that cannot lie sit mourning on the ground. Let holy horror blanch each cheek, pale every brow with fears. And rocks and stones, if ye could speak, you well might melt to tears. Let sorrow breathe in every tone, in every strain ye raise. Insult not God's majestic throne with the mockery of praise. A reverend man, whose light should be the guide of age and youth, brings to the shrine of slavery the sacrifice of truth. For the direst wrong by man imposed since Sodom's fearful cry, the word of life has been unclosed to give your God the lie. Oh, when you pray for heathen lands and plead for their dark shores, remember, slavery's cruel hands make heathens at your doors.
Compiling their groundbreaking anthology of Civil War poems, Christian Miller and Faith Barrett discovered a shift in the character of war poetry as the course of the conflict advanced. And probably this is not too surprising. In the early days, patriotic appeals dominated both sides of the war. Confederate poet laureate Henry Timrod confidently announced the birth of a new nationality in 1861. Is there? And this is from Ethnogenesis. Hath not the morning dawned with added light, and shall not evening call another star out of the infinite regions of the night to mark this day in heaven? At last, we are a nation among nations, and the world shall soon behold in many a distant port another flag unfurled. By the end of the war, poets were more inclined to concentrate on the war's terrible toll. George Moses Horton, who began his poetic career as a slave providing verses for students at the University of North Carolina, joined a Michigan unit in 1865, and he was 68 at the time. Continuing to write poems for white youths to send to girlfriends and spouses, here he takes a not overly hopeful view of the future in the war's aftermath. And then in this poem, please note that the president he refers to is Jefferson Davis, not Abraham Lincoln. It's called Weep by George Moses Horton. Weep for the country in its present state, and of the gloom which still the future waits. The proud Confederate eagle heard the sound, and with her flight fell prostrate to the ground. Weep for the loss the country has sustained, by which her now dependent is in jail. Weep of him who now the war survived, the conscript husbands and the weeping wives. Weep for the seas of blood the battle cost, the souls that ever hoped forever lost. The ravage of the field with no recruit, trees by the vengeance blasted to the root. Weep for the downfall o'er your heads and chief, who sunk without a medium of relief, who fell beneath the hatchet of their pride, then, like the serpent, bit themselves and died. Weep for the downfall of your president, who far too late his folly must repent, who like the dragon did all heaven assail, and dragged his friends to limbo with his tail. Weep o'er peculiar swelling coffers void, our treasures left, and all their banks destroyed, their foundless notes replete with shame to all, expecting every day their final fall. In quest of profit never to be won, then sadly fallen and forever down.
The war affected non-combatants who wrote poetry during the 1860s as neighbors and family members went to war, often never to return. In Hearing the Battle, July 21st, 1861, and anyone know which battle that was? Keith? Where's Keith?
Bull Run.
Yes, right. The First Manassas or Bull Run. And that's the famous battle where people went and brought picnic baskets and looked down at the battlefield and expected it to all be over very quickly, as the story goes. But in this poem, Sarah Morgan Bryant Pike, who is a widely published poet, she grew up in Kentucky. She published some 30 poems in the Atlantic Monthly, which was not quite as glitzy as it is now, but was still a major literary outlet of the time. She grew up with slavery in Kentucky, but didn't really approve of slavery, and she spent the war years in Washington, D.C., where her husband worked for the Treasury Department, and he was a poet of considerable less success than she was. Wait, that's not her. There she is. Yes, yeah, there she is. In this poem, she explores the sense of frustration of a female speaker separated from the action by gender. Separated from the action by gender, she comes to regret sending her loved one off to war so that she too can experience it. An example, perhaps, of getting far more than one bargains for. Hearing the battle, July 21st, 1861. One day in the dreamy summer, on the Sabbath hills, from afar, we heard the solemn echoes of the first fierce words of war. Ah, tell me, thou veiled watcher of the storm and the calm to come, how long by the sun or shadow till these noises again are dumb? And soon, in a hush and glimmer, we thought of the dark, strange fight, whose close in a ghastly quiet lay dim in the beautiful night. Then we talked of coldness and pallor, and of things with blinded eyes that stared at the golden stillness of the moon in those lighted skies, and of souls at morning wrestling in the dust with passion and moan, so far away at evening in the silence of worlds unknown. But a delicate wind beside us was rustling the dusky hours as it gathered the dewy odors of the snowy jessamine flowers, and I gave you a spray of the blossoms and said, I shall never know how the hearts in the land are breaking, my dearest, unless you go. And that image of the moonlight on the battlefield in the aftermath of the war pops up in poem after poem and reminds us that in those days wars were fought by daylight, right? And at night you would have the battlefield in peace, often with the dead still out there, still scattered. Yes?